December 12, 1944, Camp Wheeler, Wisconsin. Edeltraud Richter stood in the mess hall line, her stomach twisted into a knot of anticipation and dread. She had not eaten a proper meal in 6 weeks, not since her capture near the Belgian border, where she had served as a radio operator for the Wehrmacht Communications Unit. The transport ships across the Atlantic had provided barely enough food to keep the prisoners alive, thin soup and hard bread that left everyone hollow-eyed and weak. Now, standing in this American prisoner of war camp with 27 other German women, she expected more of the same. Punishment rations, starvation as revenge. It was what she would have expected for enemy prisoners in Germany. The American soldier behind the serving counter, a stocky man with a name tag reading Mills, looked at her with an expression she could not quite read. Not hatred, not even the cold indifference she had steeled herself to endure. He seemed almost cheerful as he lifted an enormous serving spoon and deposited a mountain of something onto her tin plate. The food was pale yellow, steaming, and topped with what appeared to be crispy breadcrumbs. The portion was so large it nearly spilled over the edges of the plate. Edeltraud stared at it, unable to move. Behind her, Lotta Brenner gasped audibly. The sound broke through the shock that had paralyzed the entire line of prisoners. This had to be a mistake. A test, perhaps, or some kind of cruel joke before they took the food away and laughed at the desperate hope in the prisoners' eyes. "Tuna casserole," Corporal Mills said in English, gesturing at the food with his spoon. "Good stuff. My ma's recipe." When the women continued to stare in frozen confusion, he added more slowly, as if volume would bridge the language gap. "You eat. Go on." Ketha Seidel, standing third in line, was the first to find her voice. Her English was halting but functional. All this, for us?" she asked, pointing at the heaping plate in Edeltraud's trembling hands. Mills looked genuinely puzzled by the question. "Well, sure. Can't have you ladies going hungry. There's plenty more if you want seconds." He gestured toward the massive pot behind him, still half full of the mysterious casserole. The casual generosity in his tone suggested he had no idea he had just shattered everything these women thought they understood about their captors. Edeltraud carried her plate to the nearest table and sat down slowly, as if any sudden movement might cause this strange dream to evaporate. The other women followed, each bearing impossibly full plates. They sat in silence, 28 German prisoners staring at more food than most had seen in months. Wilhelmine Lang began to cry quietly, tears running down her gaunt cheeks and dripping onto the steaming casserole. No one moved to take a first bite. They simply could not believe this was real. To understand why a simple plate of tuna casserole could reduce battle-hardened women to tears, one must understand what hunger had become in the final year of the war. Edeltraud had grown up in Dresden, the daughter of a postal clerk and a seamstress. Her childhood memories were filled with her mother's sauerbraten and fresh brötchen from the bakery down the street. Food had once been a celebration, a comfort, a daily reminder of home and family. By 1943, it had become an obsession that consumed every waking thought. The ration cards that governed civilian life in Germany had grown increasingly worthless as the war dragged on. Butter became a memory. Meat appeared perhaps once every 2 weeks, if at all. Edeltraud's mother had learned to make soup from potato peels and to stretch a single egg across 3 days of meals. Still, they considered themselves fortunate. They were not starving, not like the people in the occupied territories or the cities that had been bombed into rubble. When Edeltraud joined the Women's Auxiliary Corps in the spring of 1943, she told herself it was patriotic duty that motivated her. In truth, the promise of regular meals had been equally compelling. Military personnel received better rations than civilians, a fact that filled her with guilt even as her stomach welcomed the improved portions. She became a communications specialist, learning to operate radio equipment and cipher machines. The work was technical, precise, and far removed from the actual violence of combat. She could tell herself she was serving her country without directly contributing to the deaths of others. The other women in her unit had similar stories. Lotta had joined because her family's bakery had been destroyed in an air raid, leaving them with nothing. Keta sought escape from a father who drank away what little money the family had. Wilhelmine had lost 2 brothers on the Eastern Front and wanted to feel she was doing something, anything, to make their sacrifice meaningful. They were not ideologues or true believers in the Reich's grand vision. They were young women trying to survive in a world that had grown increasingly desperate and dark. By the autumn of 1944, even military rations had deteriorated. The communications unit to which Edeltraud was assigned moved constantly as Allied forces advanced through France and Belgium. Supply lines stretched thin and then broke entirely. Some days brought nothing but weak coffee and a handful of dried peas. Edeltraud learned to ignore the constant gnawing in her stomach, to function despite the lightheadedness that came from too many days without adequate nutrition. Their capture came almost as a relief, at least initially. The unit had been trapped in a small Belgian village as American forces encircled the area. Their commanding officer, a weary captain who looked 20 years older than his actual age, made the decision to surrender rather than see his personnel killed in a pointless last stand. The Americans had been efficient, almost businesslike in processing the prisoners. They took weapons, checked identification papers, and loaded everyone onto trucks without excessive force or cruelty. But then came the transport ship, and with it a return to the gnawing hunger that had become so familiar. Corporal Franklin Mills had grown up on a dairy farm in rural Minnesota, where his mother had fed not just her own family of 7 children, but also any neighbor, traveling salesman, or stranger who happened to arrive near mealtime. To turn someone away hungry was, in her view, a sin worse than most of the offenses mentioned in Sunday sermons. Franklin had absorbed this philosophy so completely that he barely recognized it as philosophy at all. It was simply how decent people behaved. When the Army assigned him to kitchen duty at Camp Wheeler, he brought his mother's convictions with him. The camp itself was a hastily constructed facility designed to house the unexpected influx of German prisoners, particularly the women who posed unique logistical challenges for the military bureaucracy. Most prisoner of war camps held men with established protocols and procedures. The arrival of 28 German women in November of 1944 had thrown the local command into confusion. Captain Ruth Gallagher, assigned to oversee the facility, had done her best to create appropriate accommodations. Separate barracks, female guards when possible, and strict rules about interactions between male staff and prisoners. But no one had thought much about the food until Franklin Mills took one look at the standard prison rations being proposed and declared them unacceptable. "These are women who've been half-starved," he told Captain Gallagher bluntly. "Some of them look like they haven't had a decent meal in months. We feed them like this, and we'll have sick prisoners on our hands. Sick prisoners mean more work for everyone, and possible deaths we'll have to answer for." Captain Gallagher, a practical woman from Boston who had taught mathematics before the war, saw the logic in his argument. She authorized him to requisition additional supplies from the main base commissary. Franklin had taken that authorization and run with it, viewing it as permission to operate his kitchen the way his mother had operated hers, with abundance, generosity, and the firm belief that good food could heal more than just physical hunger. The camp kitchen was nothing fancy, just a large room with industrial stoves, enormous pots, and shelving stocked with more food than most civilians had seen in years. Franklin walked through it each morning with something approaching reverence. Canned tuna by the case, sacks of flour, sugar, and potatoes that seemed bottomless, powdered milk and eggs preserved in mysterious solutions, vegetables in quantities that boggled the mind. This was American abundance, the productive capacity of a nation whose farmland had never seen bombardment, whose supply chains remained intact. Private Harold Zimmerman, who assisted in the kitchen, had initially questioned Franklin's approach to feeding the prisoners. "Corporal, don't you think you're being a bit generous with the portions? They're enemy prisoners, after all." Franklin had fixed him with a look that mixed disappointment and determination. "They're prisoners of war, son, not animals. Geneva Convention says we feed them the same rations as our own troops, and my mama taught me that you never let anyone leave your table hungry." That philosophy had been on full display when the German women first entered the mess hall. Franklin had prepared his mother's tuna casserole, a simple dish of canned tuna, egg noodles, cream sauce, and a crispy breadcrumb topping. Nothing fancy, just honest comfort food meant to stick to the ribs and provide genuine nourishment. The first bite was the hardest. Edeltraud sat with her fork hovering over the steaming casserole for what felt like an eternity, watching the other women around her struggle with the same paralysis. Finally, Lotta Brenner, seated across from her, closed her eyes and took a small, tentative forkful. Her expression transformed instantly, not just from hunger satisfied, but from something deeper. The shock of tasting cream, real cream, mixed with pasta that had been cooked until tender, not the hard, barely edible noodles they had choked down on the transport ship. "Gott im Himmel," Lotta whispered, her eyes filling with fresh tears. She took another bite, then another, suddenly unable to stop herself. Around the table, her surrender gave permission to the others. Forks began to move, slowly at first, then with increasing urgency as months of deprivation met American plenty. Edeltraud tasted the casserole and felt her carefully constructed defenses crumble. The dish was rich, savory, filling in a way that went beyond mere calories. There were chunks of real tuna, not the mysterious fish paste they sometimes received in Germany. The noodles were soft and buttery. The breadcrumb topping added a satisfying crunch. But more than the individual components, it was the sheer generosity of the portion that undid her. This was not survival rations grudgingly distributed. This was food meant to nourish, to comfort, to satisfy. Käthe Seidel, who had been a school teacher before the war, ate with careful precision, as if analyzing each component of the dish. She was the one brave enough to articulate what they were all thinking. "This makes no sense," she said quietly in German, her voice barely audible over the sounds of eating. "Why would they feed us like this? We are their enemies. We should be punished, not—" She gestured helplessly at her nearly empty plate. "Not fed better than we ate in our own country." Wilhelmine Lang, who had been crying earlier, had composed herself enough to respond. "Perhaps it is a trick. Make us comfortable, make us grateful, so we will tell them military secrets." But even as she said it, her tone suggested she did not quite believe her own explanation. The food was too real, too generous, too immediate to be some elaborate interrogation technique. Hannelore Weber, the youngest of the group at just 19 years old, had already finished her entire plate. She sat staring at the empty tin with an expression of profound loss, as if the act of finishing had returned her to the reality of scarcity. She glanced toward the serving line where Corporal Mills still stood beside his enormous pot, then looked back at her companions with desperate hope in her eyes. "He said something," Hannelore whispered. "In English. Something about more?" She looked to Käthe, whose English was the best among them. "Did he say we could have more?" Käthe nodded slowly, her expression troubled. "He said there is plenty. He said we could have seconds." The word seconds hung in the air like an impossible promise. Seconds implied that the first serving had not been a mistake or a singular indulgence. It implied that abundance was not just available, but expected. Edeltraud watched as internal struggles played out on every face around her. Pride warred with hunger. Suspicion battled against the memory of that first incredible taste. German discipline fought against very human need. 2 weeks after their arrival, Captain Ruth Gallagher called an unexpected assembly. The 28 German women gathered in the recreation hall, standing in loose formation as they had been taught, their faces carefully neutral. They had learned by now that the Americans were not cruel, but old habits of military caution died hard. Edeltraud noticed that most of the women had already begun to look healthier. Cheeks that had been hollow now showed the first hints of fullness. Eyes that had been dull with malnutrition now held clarity and alertness. Captain Gallagher stood before them with Lieutenant Barbara Stone serving as translator. "Ladies," she began, waiting for the translation to follow, "tomorrow is Thanksgiving. It's an American holiday where we give thanks for our blessings and share a feast with family and friends." She paused, seeming to choose her next words carefully. "You are far from your families, and I know these circumstances are difficult, but tomorrow you will eat the same meal that every American soldier and every American family will be eating, turkey with all the fixings." The translation created confusion rather than clarity. Lotta leaned toward Edeltraud and whispered, "What is fixings?" But the uncertainty about vocabulary paled beside the larger implication. A feast, not just adequate rations, but an actual feast, shared with them as if they were honored guests rather than enemy prisoners. The next day arrived with the kind of bitter Wisconsin cold that made Edeltraud think of home, of Dresden winters where snow transformed the city into something beautiful and treacherous. But inside the mess hall, warmth and the most extraordinary smells she had ever encountered greeted them. Corporal Mills had been working since before dawn, and the evidence of his labor was overwhelming. The serving line that day looked nothing like the utilitarian food distribution the women had grown accustomed to. There were multiple stations, each offering a different dish. Mills stood at the first, wielding a carving knife with the confidence of long practice, slicing thick pieces from golden brown turkeys that seemed impossibly large. Private Zimmerman manned the next station, spooning out stuffing that smelled of sage and butter. Sergeant Chester Armstrong, whom the women had learned was Mills's immediate superior, served mashed potatoes so fluffy they looked like clouds. And there was more. Sweet potatoes topped with something dark and sweet, green beans mixed with crispy onions, cranberry sauce that gleamed like jewels, rolls so soft and white they seemed almost unreal, and at the end of the line, multiple pies, pumpkin, apple, and pecan, their crusts perfectly golden, their fillings rich and aromatic. Edeltraud moved through the line in a daze, her plate growing heavier with each addition until she could barely carry it. Around her she heard sharp intakes of breath, whispered German exclamations, and more than one woman struggling not to cry. This was not survival. This was not even adequate nutrition. This was abundance on a scale that most of them had never experienced even before the war. When all 28 women were seated with their impossible plates of food, Captain Gallagher stood and raised a glass of cider. "In America," she said through Lieutenant Stone's translation, "we begin Thanksgiving by saying what we're grateful for. Today I'm grateful that the war in Europe is nearly over. I'm grateful that we can observe the rules of civilized warfare even in these difficult times. And I'm grateful that we can share this meal together." She sat down without ceremony, and the hall filled with the sound of silverware against plates. Wilhelmine Lang was the first to break. She had managed 3 bites of turkey, 1 spoonful of stuffing, before her fork clattered to her plate, and she buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with sobs. The Thanksgiving feast had cracked something open in the compound, a barrier that neither side had fully acknowledged until it began to crumble. In the days that followed, the mess hall became less a place of silent, efficient eating and more a space where tentative connections formed over shared meals. Corporal Mills noticed the change immediately. The German women no longer approached the serving line with fear and suspicion. They met his eyes, offered small nods of acknowledgement, and a few of the braver ones attempted English phrases. Thank you, and good appeared with increasing frequency, pronounced carefully and with visible effort. It was Wilhelmine who first asked if she could help in the kitchen. Her English was limited, but she managed to convey her request through gestures and the few words she knew. Mills, after checking with Captain Gallagher, agreed. He was curious to see what would happen when the barrier between server and served dissolved entirely. Wilhelmine proved to be a skilled and intuitive cook, her hands moving with the confidence of someone who had spent years preparing meals. She watched how Mills made his casseroles and stews, asked questions through improvised sign language, and began to understand the grammar of American cooking. Cream sauce as base, casserole as form, abundance as philosophy. One afternoon, Wilhelmine gestured for Mills to watch her. She had gathered ingredients he recognized, but had never thought to combine in quite this way: eggs, flour, salt, water. Her hands worked the dough with practiced efficiency, kneading until it reached a consistency that satisfied some internal standard. Then she began rolling it thin, cutting it into irregular shapes, and dropping the pieces into boiling salted water. When they floated to the surface, she scooped them out and topped them with browned butter. "Spätzle," she said, offering him a forkful. Mills tasted the small dumplings and immediately understood. This was German comfort food, simple and honest, the kind of dish that spoke of home and childhood and everything these women had lost. He grinned and pointed to his pot of egg noodles. Same idea, different shape. Wilhelmine smiled back, a real smile, the first he had seen from any of the prisoners. The breakthrough inspired others. Sergeant Armstrong, who supervised the kitchen operations, found himself teaching Kata how to make proper American biscuits. She struggled at first with the concept of not overworking the dough, her German precision fighting against the American preference for rough, quick mixing. Light touch, Armstrong demonstrated, barely bringing the dough together before cutting out rounds. When the biscuits emerged from the oven, tall and flaky, Ketha's face lit up with genuine accomplishment. In exchange, she taught him a recipe her grandmother had made, a simple potato soup enriched with bacon and caraway seeds. Armstrong discovered that the flavors were not so different from dishes his own grandmother had made. Poverty and hardship created similar cuisines across cultures, he realized. The need to make something satisfying from humble ingredients transcended national boundaries. Edeltraud found herself drawn into the kitchen, not just to cook, but to translate. Her English had improved dramatically, motivated by curiosity and the desire to understand these Americans who treated their enemies with unexpected generosity. Through her, recipes crossed enemy lines. American pot roast met German sauerbraten. Apple pie and Apfelstrudel shared techniques despite different names. Food had become their common language, more eloquent than any words. January of 1945 brought the first mail delivery from Germany through the International Red Cross. Captain Gallagher distributed the letters personally, watching as the German women tore open envelopes with trembling hands. Edeltraud received a single thin sheet of paper from her mother, dated 3 months earlier. The words were carefully chosen, constrained by censorship and the knowledge that others would read them, but the meaning beneath was clear enough. "We are managing as best we can," her mother wrote. "Your father's ration card allows us 150 grams of bread daily. We are fortunate compared to many. The Hoffmans next door lost their youngest to pneumonia last week. The doctor said malnutrition weakened him too much to fight the illness. I think of you constantly and pray you are safe." 150 grams of bread. Edeltraud looked down at her breakfast plate, still holding remnants of scrambled eggs, toast with real butter, and oatmeal sweetened with brown sugar. She had eaten more in this single meal than her parents received in an entire day. The plate suddenly felt obscene, the abundance transformed from blessing to accusation. Around her, Other women were reading their own letters, their faces reflecting similar realizations. Lotta learned that her sister had given birth to a baby who died within a week, the mother too malnourished to produce adequate milk. Katha discovered that her elderly parents were surviving on potato peels and whatever they could grow in their small garden. Hannelor's letter reported that her younger brother, just 14 years old, had been pressed into service with the Volkssturm, the desperate last-line defense force composed of children and old men. The contrast between their situation and their family's suffering created a moral crisis that no amount of rationalization could resolve. They were eating better as American prisoners than their own loved ones ate as German civilians. The equation was impossible, obscene, and undeniable. That evening in the barracks, the women gathered in small clusters, speaking in hushed German about the impossible guilt that now accompanied every meal. Wilhelmine, who had been so happy in the kitchen just days before, now questioned whether she had any right to enjoy cooking while her family starved. "How can I smile over apple pie when my mother is eating grass soup?" she asked, her voice breaking. Edeltraud had no answer. None of them did. They could not send food packages back to Germany. The war made such exchanges impossible. They could not refuse the food they were given, as that would accomplish nothing except their own suffering added to their family's misery. They were trapped in a situation where their own nourishment felt like betrayal, where every full stomach came weighted with unbearable knowledge. Ute Brandt, who rarely spoke in group settings, finally voiced what they were all thinking. "The Americans feed their enemies better than our government fed its own people. What does that tell us about who we were really serving?" The question hung in the cold barracks air, unanswered and unanswerable, as devastating as any bomb. April of 1945 brought news that transformed guilt into horror. American newspapers began publishing photographs from liberated concentration camps, and Captain Gallagher made the difficult decision to allow the German prisoners access to these reports. She believed they had a right to know what had been done in their country's name, even if the knowledge would be devastating. Edeltraud sat in the camp library, staring at grainy photographs from Bergen-Belsen. The images showed human beings reduced to walking skeletons, piles of emaciated corpses, and survivors whose eyes held horrors beyond comprehension. The accompanying articles described systematic starvation, deliberate deprivation, death by hunger, inflicted as policy rather than consequence of war. These people had been starved intentionally while she and her fellow soldiers received military rations. The geometry of evil suddenly became clear. Katha read aloud from an article about Dachau, her voice hollow and mechanical. Prisoners received 200 calories daily. Many survived on grass and potato peels scavenged from garbage. Death by starvation was common and expected. She looked up at the other women gathered around the newspapers. 200 calories. We complained when our military rations dropped below 2,000. The contrast between the camps revealed in these photographs and the camp where they now lived created a cognitive dissonance so profound that several women became physically ill. Bridget Keller ran from the library and vomited in the yard, her body rejecting not food, but truth. Matilda Pfeiffer sat motionless for 3 hours, staring at a single photograph, tears running silently down her face. That evening, Corporal Mills served beef stew with fresh bread, the same generous portions he always provided. The German women moved through the serving line like ghosts, accepting food they could barely look at. Edeltraud sat before her full bowl and understood with terrible clarity that this abundance, this casual American generosity toward enemies, made the contrast with their own country's deliberate cruelty impossible to ignore. Wilhelmine pushed her untouched stew away and spoke in English, her voice raw. "You feed us good. You feed us like people. My country made people into Skeleton Memorial. I will feed people generously because Corporal Mills taught me that feeding your enemy is more powerful than starving them. I will remember that hospitality is not weakness, but strength." Lotta spoke last, her words carrying the weight of decision. "We cannot undo what was done. We cannot bring back the dead or erase our country's sins. But we can refuse to forget what we learned here, that full plates can be offered without conditions, that enemies can become human through shared meals, that abundance should never again be weaponized through its denial." Edeltraud pulled out the small notebook where she had been recording recipes Mills had taught her. American dishes written in German script, with notes about technique and philosophy. 20 years later, 1965. Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Edeltraud Richter stood in the kitchen of her restaurant, a modest establishment she had named The Bridge. The menu offered both German and American dishes, served side by side without hierarchy or judgment. Sauerbraten next to pot roast, spätzle alongside macaroni and cheese, and always prominently featured the dish that had changed her life: tuna casserole, made according to Corporal Franklin Mills's mother's recipe. Her children, born in America to a German mother and an American father she had met 5 years after the war ended, often asked about the origins of the restaurant. Today, her daughter Anna, named after no one in particular, but carrying a name that felt right, had asked again, "Mama, why do you always make so much food? Why do you never let anyone leave hungry?" Edeltraud set down her wooden spoon and gestured for Anna to sit. At 12 years old, her daughter was old enough to understand the story. "During the war," she began, "I was captured by American soldiers and held in a prison camp not far from here. I expected cruelty. I expected starvation. Instead, I found a man who believed that feeding people was a moral obligation, regardless of who they were or what uniform they had worn." She pulled out the old notebook, its pages yellowed and stained with 20 years of kitchen use. "This is more than recipes. This is proof that humanity can survive even war, that abundance shared is more powerful than scarcity weaponized, that the simple act of offering seconds can challenge everything someone believes about enemies and identity." Anna looked at the faded handwriting, a mixture of German and English. Recipes recorded in the hand of a young woman learning that her entire understanding of the world had been wrong. "Was it hard?" she asked. "Coming here after the war?" "Harder than you can imagine," Edeltraud admitted, "but also easier than it should have been, because I had already learned the most important lesson, that Americans saw me as a person first, an enemy second, that they believed in redemption, in second chances, in the possibility that people could change." She thought of the others. Wilhelmine had returned to Germany and opened a soup kitchen in Hamburg, feeding anyone on purpose, made them eat grass while we ate bread. She buried her face in her hands. "I did not know, but I should have known. I should have asked where the food went, who was hungry, why we ate when others starved." Mills sat down across from her, his usual cheerfulness replaced by somber understanding. "You were lied to," he said quietly. "Your whole country was lied to." But his absolution felt hollow to Edeltraud. Being lied to was not the same as being innocent. Ignorance was not the same as blamelessness. Lotta spoke, the thought they all shared. "Every time we take seconds here, we prove that food was never actually scarce. The cruelty was the point. Abundance existed, but some people were deemed unworthy of it." She looked at her full bowl with something approaching hatred. How do we ever eat without remembering what eating was denied to others? May 8th, 1945. Victory in Europe Day arrived with church bells ringing across America, but in the barracks at Camp Wheeler, the German women greeted the news of their country's surrender with complicated silence. The war was over. Repatriation would begin soon. They would return to whatever remained of Germany, of their families, of their former lives. Captain Gallagher called an assembly 3 days later to explain the process. "Transportation will be arranged within the month," she told them through Lieutenant Stone's translation. "You'll be processed through displaced persons camps in Europe before being released to return to your homes." She paused, her expression softening. I know many of you are anxious about what you'll find there. The Red Cross will assist in locating family members. That evening, the women gathered in the barracks for what would be one of their final conversations as a group. The question that had been building since the concentration camp revelations finally demanded to be spoken. Edeltraud was the one who voiced it. "When we return, what do we tell people about this place? About how we were treated?" Brandt responded immediately. "We tell them the truth, that Americans fed us better than our own government fed its citizens, that our enemy showed us more humanity than our leaders showed to millions." Her voice carried an edge of anger that had been absent before. "We tell them that abundance was always possible, that hunger was a choice, that cruelty was policy." But Hannelore, the youngest, shook her head in fear. "If we say these things, we'll be called traitors, collaborators. People will say we were corrupted by the Americans, that we betrayed our country." She looked around at her companions. "They won't want to hear that the enemy was kind. It makes everything too complicated." Kata, ever the teacher, stood and addressed them all. "Then we must be complicated. We must carry this complexity back with us. Yes, we will be uncomfortable. Yes, people will not want to hear what we have learned, but we owe it to those who died in the camps, who starved while food existed, to refuse the simple stories that made such horrors possible." Wilhelmine added her own conviction. "When I cook again in Germany, every meal will who arrived hungry." Kata taught school in Berlin, incorporating lessons about the power of generosity into her curriculum. Lotta had emigrated to Canada and worked with refugee organizations. Each had carried forward the lesson learned in Camp Wheeler that food offered freely was an act of resistance against the cruelty they had witnessed. Edeltraud had stayed in touch with Corporal Mills through letters. He had returned to his Minnesota farm after the war, never fully understanding the profound impact his simple generosity had created. "I just fed people," he wrote once. "Like my mama taught me, nothing special about that." But it had been special, extraordinary even, in its ordinariness. The restaurant's evening service would begin soon. Edeltraud tied on her apron and began preparing the day's tuna casserole, the recipe she had committed to memory in 1944. Each generous portion served was a memorial, a promise, and a reminder that enemies could share meals and discover their common humanity, that abundance should never be denied to anyone.